My Uncle Roy was the kind of man who commanded attention wherever he went. With his tailored suits, booming voice, and air of superiority, he made sure everyone knew he was the most successful person in the room. Roy built his wealth through years of hard work, or so he liked to remind us at every family gathering. He loved to brag about his real estate investments, his vacation homes, and his thriving company. To be fair, he did help out the family when he felt like it. Birthdays, lavish gifts, emergencies. He'd swoop in with a check, but never without a reminder of his generosity. He didn't have a wife or kids, and though he was supportive in his own way, his relationships always felt transactional. Roy trusted no one, not even the family he helped support. That paranoia ran deep, and it eventually led him to do something none of us could have predicted. It started during one of Roy's infamous backyard barbecues. He'd invited the whole family to his sprawling estate, a massive house with a tennis court, a pool, and gardens meticulously maintained by professionals. It was his pride and joy, and he never let us forget it. The day began like any other. Kids splashed in the pool, the adults sipped wine on the patio, and Roy basked in the glow of his own success. But as the afternoon wore on, something shifted. At some point, I went inside to grab a drink and found Roy standing in the kitchen, staring out the sliding glass doors. His usually confident demeanor was gone. His face was pale, and his hands gripped the counter tightly. I followed his gaze and saw what had rattled him. Two of my aunts, Linda and Carol, were sitting at a table on the patio, speaking in low voices. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I realized they were talking about Roy. "Look at this place," Linda said, gesturing at the manicured lawn. "You think he's leaving all of this to charity?" Carol chuckled. "I don't know. Maybe. He's always been the type to want his name on a plaque somewhere." "Probably," Linda agreed, taking a sip of her drink. "But if he doesn't, someone's going to get very lucky when he finally kicks the bucket." I glanced at Roy. His face had gone from pale to red. His jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might snap. He didn't say a word, just turned abruptly and walked away, disappearing down the hall. The rest of the day felt off. Roy barely spoke, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet intensity. He retreated to his office for most of the evening, and by the time the barbecue ended, he hadn't said goodbye to anyone. The next morning, I got an unexpected call from him. "Come over," he said, his tone short and clipped. "What's going on?" I asked, caught off guard. "I need to talk to you about something important," he said. "Just get here." He hung up before I could ask anything else. When I arrived at his house, Roy was waiting for me in the living room, pacing back and forth. He looked like he hadn't slept. The usual sharpness in his appearance was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, and his tie hung loosely around his neck. "I'm glad you came," he said, barely glancing at me before resuming his pacing. "Is everything okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "No," he said bluntly. "It's not." He stopped and turned to face me, his expression a mix of anger and determination. "I overheard some of the family talking yesterday. They're already planning what to do with my estate. My money, my house, everything. Like I'm not even here." I didn't know what to say. I had heard the conversation too, but I didn't think it had been serious. "Roy," I started, but he cut me off. "I've spent my entire life building what I have," he said. "And now they're circling like vultures, waiting for me to drop dead. Well, I'm not going to let them get away with it." "What do you mean?" I asked, unease creeping into my voice. "I've decided to find out who deserves what I've built," he said, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "And to do that, I need to see how they act when I'm gone." I frowned, not understanding. "What are you talking about?" "I'm going to fake my death," he said, his voice calm but filled with conviction. At first I thought he was joking, but as he laid out his plan, it became clear he was completely serious. Roy wanted to stage his death, complete with an obituary and a fake funeral, to see how the family reacted. "I need to know the truth," he said. "Who's loyal, who's greedy, who actually gives a damn about me." The only way to do that is to take myself out of the equation and watch what happens. It was absurd, borderline insane. But when Roy got an idea in his head, there was no talking him out of it. Do you realize how risky this is? I asked. What if someone finds out? What if it backfires? It won't, he said confidently. I'll make sure it's airtight. You're the only one who knows, and I trust you to keep it that way. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse, to walk out and let him figure out his own mess. But another part of me was curious to see how far he'd go and how the family would react. The next week was a whirlwind of preparations. Roy contacted a private investigator to help him craft a believable backstory for his death. A car accident, they decided. Quick, clean, and easy to explain. Roy even went so far as to have a fake death certificate created. He hired someone to pose as the executor of his estate, a man who would step in after the funeral to begin sorting out the inheritance. Meanwhile, Roy planned to watch everything unfold from a remote cabin he owned in the mountains. By the time the obituary was published in the local paper, it felt disturbingly real. The headline read, "Prominent businessman Roy Callahan dies in tragic accident." Calls from family members started flooding in almost immediately. The shock was palpable, everyone was blindsided. And then, as Roy had predicted, the vultures began circling. The obituary hit the family like a bomb. Within hours of it being published, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Everyone was shocked by Roy's death, though the reactions varied wildly. Some were distraught, some seemed genuinely upset, and others were already asking questions about his estate. By the evening, the family group chat was in chaos. Messages ranged from condolences to speculation about what Roy had left behind. "I can't believe he's gone," my cousin Melanie wrote. "Uncle Roy was always so generous. Do we know who's handling his estate?" Aunt Carol chimed in. "I mean, it must be a massive amount to sort through." And then there was Linda, who never even tried to hide her intentions. "I wonder if he left instructions about the house," she wrote. "It'd be such a shame if it got sold off to strangers." I glanced at the messages and sighed. Roy had been right. They were already circling like vultures. The next day, Roy's private investigator, posing as the executor of his estate, called a family meeting to discuss the inheritance. The meeting was set for the following weekend, and everyone was expected to attend. Meanwhile, Roy was safely tucked away in his remote cabin, monitoring everything through me. He'd given me a burner phone to keep him updated, though he'd warned me not to say too much. "Just tell me what I need to know," he'd said. "I don't want to get emotional about it." But as the days passed, it became clear he couldn't help himself. "Who's acting the greediest?" he asked during one of our calls. "Linda, obviously," I said. "She's already talking about the house like it's hers. She even asked if she could get the pool cleaned before the weekend, in case she decides to stay over." Roy snorted. "Figures. And what about Melanie?" "She's keeping quiet," I said. "But you know her. She'll probably go along with whatever everyone else does." Roy fell silent for a moment. "And my brother? Has he said anything?" "Not much," I admitted. "But he did mention something about your coin collection. I think he's trying to act like he's above it all, but he's just as interested as the rest of them." Roy sighed heavily. "They don't even care that I'm dead, do they?" I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, some of them cared, but not enough to outweigh their curiosity about the money. The day of the family meeting arrived, and I found myself sitting in Roy's massive living room, surrounded by relatives. The atmosphere was tense, like everyone was trying to act sad while secretly wondering what they'd get. The private investigator, playing the role of the executor, stepped forward with a folder of documents. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone professional. "As you know, Mr. Callahan left behind a substantial estate. Today we'll be reviewing the initial terms of his will." Everyone leaned forward slightly, their expressions a mix of anticipation and forced solemnity. "First," the investigator continued, "Mr. Callahan specified that his funeral expenses were to be paid out of the estate. Since he requested a private service, those costs have already been accounted for. Aunt Linda raised her hand, cutting him off. Wait, what do you mean private service? Why weren't we invited? Mr. Callahan wanted something small and discreet, the investigator said smoothly. He didn't want to burden the family. Linda huffed but didn't press further. The investigator moved on, listing off smaller details, donations Roy had made to a few charities, some debts that needed settling. But then he paused, glancing at the room with a faintly amused expression. And now for the division of assets, he said. The room went completely silent. The first major announcement was the house. Everyone had assumed Roy would leave it to the family, but the investigator revealed that he had willed it to a local historical society. The room erupted into protests. You're kidding, Linda said, her voice shrill. Why would he do that? This house has been in the family for years. Mr. Callahan felt it was important to preserve the property's historical significance. The investigator said calmly. This is ridiculous, Linda snapped. He wouldn't do that. Are you sure this is accurate? It's all in the will, the investigator replied, tapping the folder. Next came Roy's coin collection, which had apparently been sold before his death, with the proceeds donated to an education fund. That news went over just as poorly. An education fund? My uncle Roy's brother said, his voice filled with disbelief. He loved that collection. Why would he sell it? The investigator shrugged. He didn't specify his reasons, but the funds have already been distributed. By this point, the room was buzzing with anger and confusion. It was clear that no one was getting what they'd expected, and the frustration was palpable. The final blow came when the investigator announced that the remaining liquid assets, Roy's savings, investments, and stocks, were being held in a trust, with the executor tasked with determining who, if anyone, deserved to inherit them. What does that even mean? Linda demanded. It means the funds won't be distributed immediately, the investigator said. Mr. Callahan wanted to ensure that only those who truly valued his legacy would benefit from it. I'll be conducting interviews with each of you in the coming weeks to assess your intentions. The room exploded. People were shouting over each other, demanding explanations, questioning the legality of the will. Through it all, the investigator remained calm, repeating that he was simply following Roy's instructions. As I sat there, watching the chaos unfold, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of amusement and sadness. Roy had been right. Most of them cared more about his money than about him, and he was about to find out just how far they were willing to go. That evening, I called Roy to update him. How did it go? He asked, his voice crackling over the burner phone. Exactly how you expected, I said. They're furious. Linda's practically foaming at the mouth, and your brother's not far behind. The trust threw them all off. They don't know how to handle it. Roy chuckled. Good. Let them stew for a while. This is only the beginning. I hesitated before asking, what happens next? Roy's voice turned serious. Next, we see who's willing to play dirty, and who's worth keeping around. After the so-called family meeting, the tension within the family hit a boiling point. Calls and texts started flying left and right, each one dripping with frustration, entitlement, or outright fury. Everyone wanted answers about Roy's estate, but the truth was, they didn't care about honoring his legacy. They cared about what they were getting. Roy had planned this chaos perfectly, and I could see it unfolding just the way he intended. His decision to put the inheritance into a trust and leave the distribution up to the executor had thrown everyone into a frenzy. Now, it wasn't just about what they thought they were entitled to, it was about proving they deserved it. And they were going to fight for it. The first sign of just how desperate things had become came a few days after the meeting. I got a call from Linda, who wasted no time cutting to the chase. Alex, she said, her voice tight with frustration. You're close to the executor, right? I hesitated. I guess so. Why? Well, she said, her tone shifting to something almost sweet. I was thinking maybe you could put in a good word for me. You know, let him know how much Roy and I always got along. I nearly laughed out loud. Linda had spent years rolling her eyes at Roy's stories, calling him a show-off behind his back. And now she wanted me to vouch for her? I don't think that's how it works, I said carefully. Oh, come on, she pressed. You know he trusted you. If you just mentioned to the executor how much I appreciated Roy, it could really help. Appreciated him? I repeated. Like when you said he was probably leaving everything to charity because he wanted his name on a plaque? There was a long pause. That's not fair, Linda said finally, her tone defensive. I was joking. You know how I am. Yeah, I said. I do. I ended the call shortly after, but I knew this was just the beginning. I mean, what does he expect us to do? He said angrily. Jump through hoops like circus animals just to get what's rightfully ours? Apparently, I said, struggling not to laugh. It's ridiculous, he muttered. But I'm not letting this go without a fight. The next day, I found out what he meant. I got a call from Roy on the burner phone. Your uncle called the executor, he said, his tone somewhere between amused and annoyed. He offered him a bribe. What? I asked, genuinely shocked. 10 grand, Roy said, to speed things up and make sure he gets his fair share of the estate. Couldn't believe it. What did the executor say? He told him it wasn't going to happen, Roy replied. But don't worry, this is exactly what I wanted. I need to see who's willing to stoop the lowest. Congratulations, I said dryly. You're getting your wish. The bribe wasn't the only dirty move. A few days later, I found out that Linda had been calling the executor as well, but instead of bribing him, she'd gone with a different approach, bad-mouthing the rest of the family. Melanie's never even been to this house, she apparently said. And don't get me started on Roy's brother. He didn't even visit Roy when he was sick. When I told Roy about it, he laughed so hard I thought he might choke. Unbelievable, he said. They're eating each other alive. You think this is funny? I asked, half joking. I think it's revealing, he said. This is exactly what I needed to see. None of them actually cared about me. They cared about my money. And what happens when they realize there's nothing left to fight over? I asked. Roy's smile faded. We're not there yet. As the weeks dragged on, the family's desperation only grew. The executor scheduled individual interviews with each of them, supposedly to assess their intentions and decide how to distribute the trust. In reality, it was all part of Roy's plan to see how far they'd go to secure their piece of the pie. The interviews were a goldmine of drama. Linda, true to form, spent most of hers trying to discredit everyone else. I was the closest to Roy, she claimed. He always told me how much he appreciated me. I can't say the same for the others. Melanie took a different approach, playing the sympathy card. I'm not saying I deserve everything, she said. But I think Roy would have wanted someone responsible to handle his legacy. Someone who wouldn't squander it. Roy's brother, meanwhile, used his interview to rant about how unfair the whole process was. This is a waste of time, he said. Roy wouldn't have wanted us jumping through hoops like this. Through it all, the executor remained calm, taking notes and nodding along. He didn't give away anything, which only fueled the family's paranoia. By the time the final round of interviews was over, everyone was on edge. The family group chat had gone completely silent, a clear sign that no one trusted anyone anymore. One evening, I got another call from Roy. They're cracking, he said, sounding pleased. I heard from the executor today. He said they're all turning on each other. Yeah, I said. But what's your endgame here? Are you planning to come back and reveal the truth? Or are you just going to watch them tear each other apart? Roy didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his tone was thoughtful. I'm still deciding, he said. Deciding what? I asked, frustrated. Who's worth keeping around? He replied. The breaking point came when Linda, unable to stand the suspense any longer, decided to take matters into her own hands. She showed up at the house unannounced one afternoon, demanding to see the executor. When he told her that decisions were still being made, she lost it. You're dragging this out for no reason, she shouted. I deserve my share of the estate, and I'm not leaving until I get it. The executor stayed calm, repeating that the process was ongoing and that she needed to be patient. But Linda wasn't having it. I've been patient enough, she snapped. You're just trying to cheat us out of what we're owed. Her outburst was the final nail in the coffin. The executor called me later that day to let me know what had happened, and I passed the news along to Roy. She cracked, I said, just like you thought she would. Roy chuckled. Good. Now I know exactly what I'm dealing with. By the time Linda's tantrum made its way through the family grapevine, the damage was done. Whatever thin veneer of civility had existed between the relatives completely disintegrated. The group chat, once filled with polite condolences and awkward attempts at conversation, devolved into a battlefield of accusations and snide remarks. Linda accused Melanie of being a silent snake, waiting for the dust to settle so she could swoop in and take the biggest share. Melanie shot back, calling Linda a leech who had always relied on Roy's generosity to cover her bills. Meanwhile, Roy's brother took a different approach, sending passive-aggressive messages about how Roy must be rolling in his grave, watching the family fall apart. It was a disaster, and Roy loved every second of it. When I called him that evening to update him, he couldn't stop laughing. She demanded her share on the spot? He asked between fits of laughter. She did, I confirmed. It wasn't even subtle. She basically said she wasn't leaving without a check. That's priceless, Roy said. She's exactly who I thought she was. Roy, this isn't a sitcom, I said, frustrated. Your family is tearing itself apart. He didn't seem fazed. Good, let them. This is the only way to see who's worth keeping in my life. And if no one passes the test? I asked. Then I'll leave everything to charity, he said with a shrug in his voice. The next day, things escalated even further. Linda, still furious from her failed attempt to strong-arm the executor, decided to take matters into her own hands. She hired a lawyer to review the legitimacy of the trust, claiming that Roy must have been coerced into leaving his assets in such a convoluted arrangement. Word of Linda's legal maneuver spread quickly. Melanie panicked, calling me to ask if the trust could actually be overturned. I don't know, I said, feigning ignorance. But you might want to stay out of it. Getting involved could make you look bad. She sighed heavily. This is such a mess. I just want this whole thing to be over. You and everyone else, I muttered. Meanwhile, Roy's brother took a different approach. He started reaching out to other family members, trying to form alliances. Look, he told me during one of his calls. We all know Linda's only in this for herself. If we work together, we can make sure the estate is divided fairly. Fairly, I repeated, raising an eyebrow. You mean in a way that benefits you? Come on, Alex, he said, his tone turning defensive. You know I'm right. Roy wouldn't have wanted all this drama. He would have wanted us to split things evenly and move on. I didn't bother responding. While the rest of the family fought amongst themselves, the executor called another meeting to address concerns. I showed up early, partly because I wanted to see the chaos unfold and partly because Roy had asked me to keep him updated. When the others arrived, the tension was palpable. Linda refused to look at Melanie, who sat as far away from her as possible. Roy's brother, clearly irritated by the entire situation, crossed his arms and glared at the executor. The executor didn't seem bothered by the hostility. He opened the meeting with a calm but firm tone, explaining that the trust was legally binding and would not be altered under any circumstances. Linda immediately raised her hand. So you're saying there's nothing we can do? We just have to wait for you to decide who gets what. Correct, the executor said. And how long is that going to take? She demanded. As long as it takes for me to determine the best course of action, he replied smoothly. Linda huffed, but she didn't argue further. After the meeting, Roy called me to hear the details. How bad was it? He asked. Bad, I said. Linda's barely holding it together. Your brother's trying to rally support, and Melanie's pretending to be above it all. But she's just as desperate as the rest of them. Roy chuckled. Sounds about right. Roy, I said carefully. What's your plan here? Are you actually going to let the executor distribute the estate? Or are you planning to reveal the truth? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I haven't decided yet, he admitted. You haven't decided? I repeated, incredulous. Roy, this is getting out of hand. If you wait too long, they might do something drastic. That's the point, he said. I need to know exactly what they're capable of. Roy didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, Linda and Roy's brother showed up at the executor's office, demanding answers. They accused him of mishandling the trust, claiming that the delays were suspicious and possibly illegal. The executor, calm as ever, called security to escort them out. When I told Roy about it, he laughed so hard he had to put the phone down. They tried to intimidate him? He asked, wiping tears from his eyes. What did they think that would accomplish? They're desperate, I said. They'll try anything at this point. Roy's tone turned serious. Good. Let them dig their own graves. By now, the family's relationships were in complete shambles. No one trusted anyone, and every interaction was laced with suspicion. I watched from the sidelines, reporting back to Roy as he sat in his remote cabin, relishing every twist and turn. But as much as Roy enjoyed the chaos, I could tell it was starting to weigh on him. During one of our calls, he admitted that seeing his family's true colors was harder than he'd expected. They don't care about me, he said quietly. They never did. Some of them care, I said, trying to reassure him. They're just caught up in the moment. He didn't respond. A week later, Roy made his decision. He called me late one night, his voice steady but firm. It's time, he said. Time for what? I asked. To end this, he said. The executor is going to call a final meeting, and I'll be there. You're revealing the truth? I asked, stunned. Yes, he said. I've seen enough. Now, I want to see their reactions when they find out. The final meeting had an air of unease. The executor's invitation for the gathering had been brief and vague, leaving the family members to stew in their assumptions. Linda arrived first, her expression a mixture of defiance and desperation. Melanie followed soon after, quietly taking a seat in the corner, avoiding Linda's glare. Roy's brother came in next, his posture rigid with indignation. And then there was Alex, seated near the back, his face unreadable as he fiddled with his phone. When the executor entered the room, the chatter died down. He carried a single envelope and a calm expression that betrayed nothing of what was to come. Thank you all for coming, he began, his voice steady. This meeting marks the conclusion of Mr. Callahan's wishes regarding his estate. Before we proceed, there is someone who would like to address you all. Before anyone could question him, the door behind the executor opened. In walked Roy, alive, well, and with an unmistakable smirk on his face. The room erupted. Linda shot to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of shock and anger. What the hell is this? She demanded. You're alive, Melanie whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Roy raised his hands to calm the room. Yes, I'm alive, he said, his voice booming. And before you all lose your minds, let me explain. The room quieted, though the tension was palpable. Roy took a moment to survey the faces of his family members, his smirk fading into something more serious. I faked my death to see the truth, he began. To see who among you actually cared about me and who only cared about my money. A murmur swept through the room, but no one interrupted. And I got my answers, Roy continued, his gaze hardening. Linda, your tantrums and legal threats were expected. My brother, your attempts to bribe and manipulate didn't surprise me either. Melanie, I thought you might rise above it, but even you tried to angle for your share under the guise of fairness. He let his words sink in before turning to Alex, his expression softening. And then there's Alex, my trusted nephew, the only one who knew the truth from the start. The one I thought I could rely on. Alex's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. Roy continued, his voice growing colder. Imagine my surprise when I learned that you weren't just keeping me updated, he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket. Imagine how it felt to discover that you were secretly working behind my back, feeding Linda and my brother information, and even suggesting ways they could challenge the trust. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Alex, whose calm facade began to crack. "I trusted you," Roy said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "And you betrayed me." Alex finally spoke, his voice defensive. "It wasn't like that, Uncle Roy. I was just trying to keep the peace." "By undermining me?" Roy snapped. "By helping them plot against me?" Alex fell silent, unable to meet Roy's gaze. Roy took a deep breath, turning his attention back to the rest of the room. This whole charade was never about the money. It was about loyalty, respect, and family. And now, I know exactly who deserves what. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a second envelope, handing it to the executor. "This contains my final decision," he said. "I've made arrangements to ensure that my estate goes to someone who embodies those values." Linda leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Who?" she demanded. The executor opened the envelope and scanned its contents before addressing the room. "Mr. Callahan has decided to leave the entirety of his estate to his daughter." The room erupted again, this time in confusion and disbelief. "Daughter?" Melanie exclaimed. "What daughter?" Roy's expression softened. "Her name is Emily," he said. "I didn't know about her until recently. Her mother and I had a brief relationship many years ago, and she never told me about Emily. But when I found out, I knew she was the only one who truly deserved my legacy." Linda looked ready to explode. "You can't be serious. Some stranger." "She's not a stranger," Roy interrupted, his voice firm. "She's my blood. And unlike the rest of you, she has no interest in my money. She's built a life for herself, one that I'm proud of. She's everything I hoped a member of this family could be." The room fell silent, the weight of Roy's words sinking in. No one dared to speak. Roy turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Consider this a lesson," he said, his voice carrying a finality that left no room for argument. "Family isn't about blood or money. It's about trust and respect. And most of you have failed that test." With that, he walked out, leaving his stunned relatives to grapple with the fallout of his revelation. For the first time in his life, Roy felt free from their expectations, their greed, and their betrayal. He had made his choice and he didn't regret it.